Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of No One's a Critic. I'm one of your hosts, Kino, joined as always by Mac. How you doing this week, sir?
Doing excellent, Kino. Just released the video on the Shield,
Yeah.
so excited to be done with that. And then next up is going to be Better Call Saul.
Ooh,
So,
nice.
so got some people who are going to be excited about that. How about
Yeah,
yourself?
good. I was excited to see that you released a Shield video, and I don't know if I'll watch this one just because enough people have told me to watch the Shield that I might take a look at that. I get a lot of show recommendations, and a lot of them it's like, oh, I'll watch it like way in the future, just because I have so many things to tackle right now. But you've given me Shield like you've recommended a Shield to me before. Other people have, so I might check that out. And I'm excited for your Better Call Saul too, because have you seen the series yet?
Yeah, I'm all caught up.
Oh, you're all caught up. Okay, so you caught
Mhm.
up pretty quickly. Yeah, so excited to hear your takes on that. I obviously had my opinions on the last season that were a little bit controversial, but yeah, I'm excited to see where you come off on that. This week has been interesting. So I went to New Jersey last week. That's why we didn't record a podcast because I was flying. Well, actually, I went to New York. I was flying to New York. Did something over there, and then I had a chance to go to New Jersey for a little bit, and I made a little vlog where I went and sat in Holston's in the spot where Tony supposedly got shot at the end. Although that's controversial too. So that was a fun little vacation for me.
Nice. Good, good, good. What do you got on the docket for future projects or upcoming projects?
So I just released a video today, at the day we're recording this. Another Sopranos video. Just a small video talking about the Funhouse episode of like who gave Tony food poisoning. So that was a quick little project I did. But from this point on, I'm pretty much entirely focused on The Wire. So I'm gonna do a long retrospective like you've been doing with The Leftovers and with The Shield, and I'm gonna do the same thing for The Wire. And it's a huge project. It's gonna be hours long. It's gonna cover everything I have to say about The Wire, and I'm really looking forward to that because that's been a new show for me, but it's one that's grabbed my heart.
Fuck yeah. Nice.
What do you got going on too after this?
Just a Better Call Saul
Better
vid.
Call
I'm
Saul, yeah.
kind of focusing more on like the longer form vids. So that one is probably gonna be well, it took me about 2 months to finish the Shield video. Um but now that I think I'm on my like I have my schedule set down, so hopefully I can get it out a bit quicker.
Yeah,
Obviously I'm gonna do another watch through of Better Call Saul to kind of just take notes and stuff.
yeah.
But I usually something I'll do. That's what I do with the Shield. I do like I do it on like 2 times speed,
Ah,
just because like
gotcha.
I've already seen it, so it's
Yeah,
more just like refreshing myself. um. So and Better Call Saul's what like let's see,
six seasons.
63 episodes.
Yeah,
So 5 by 2, 31, 5 hours.
that's a lot of
Yeah,
time invested in just rewatching too, and that's what's taken a long time for The Wire too because I had to go through it again, and
and the
that's like a
wire's so dense. Yeah.
it's so dense. I mean, you skip out on one single thing, and I'm noticing things that I've missed on previous rewatches. This is probably my third time watching it through, and there's still details. I was like, oh my god, I didn't notice that before, and that's the kind of stuff that I want to make sure I cover, just because with shows like these, they really deserve the respect I feel like of covering them in depth, not just giving like, oh yeah, this was great or whatever, but like really, diving deep into the material because it is a really incredible show.
And it's such a dense show. Like the one thing that I'm kind of excited about Better Call Saul, which will make it a bit easier, um, is that it's not as dense. I feel like it's the story's very methodical. It's very the scene. There's not like a lot of story packed into it, and I don't want that to sound like it's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing. I think it like takes its time. Breaking Bad, I think, was the same way,
Yeah.
where over the course of a full season, not all that much happened.
Hmm.
Like big things happened, but not like too much. But it was languidly paced. It kept the
Yeah.
tension up. And Better Call Saul, I feel, is the same way to some extent.
I
Whereas a show like The Wire is like it's just so dense, like so much happens in every single episode, and so to recap it, you have to just it's like you have to read the script
mhm.
basically because there's so much going on.
Yeah, I heard this quote recently, where it was like, I forgot who it was. It was a video game developer, but they said they make simple stories with complicated characters. I'm gonna look it up right now to see if I can even find where it came from. I can't right off the top of my head, but and I feel like that's what's so great about a lot of these shows, and especially Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad. You know, the plot is relatively simple. Like, yeah, exciting stuff happens, but you're not dealing with like, you know, these really complex plots that are really hard to follow. Like a lot of Asian shows tend to have really complicated plots, but it's just the characters themselves are so complicated and so complex that that's where the magic happens. It's not in every second plot, but it's how the characters are reacting to it, how they're dealing with it, the things we're learning about them. And I think that's a great formula for any type of successful story is a simple story that's not full of a bunch of bullshit, but complicated real life characters that, you know, you want to follow.
Yeah, and for Better Call Saul, it really is more. It isn't so much like it's a pretty simple story. I would say it's not like the lawyer plot like really isn't all that super complicated, which is a good thing. Um, because but then the characters are so complex with Chuck and everyone, then that's what makes it interesting as to how do these complex characters maneuver in this somewhat simple situation. Because if it's too complicated, then it just overwhelms the characters basically because you're so focused on trying to follow the plot that you're like, hmm. I think the Shield did that pretty well as well. It got pretty complicated, but there were times when the plot sort of it left room for the characters to breathe, and that was always good.
I feel like one of the also great things a show does, when its subject matter is something a little bit complicated, is it doesn't focus so much on the subject matter but more so the consequences. Like a lot of medical dramas will do that. Like one of my favorite shows of all time is House.
Hmm.
And it's not like they do a great job of like, they have a lot of complex medical stuff going on, but they usually boil it down to like, if we give him the wrong medicine he will die, and that's the conflict of the thing. And the conflict is also usually thematically related to like something that's going on between the characters. Like the characters are dealing with like, you know, a romance situation, and that the lesson they learn from that is also important to, you know, solving the patient's case. So I think that's when you're dealing with something like the law or any of these type of shows where it's like the audience is not necessarily intimately familiar with the material you're dealing with. It's much better to focus on the consequences of like, if we get this thing wrong or if this thing happens, then this consequence will happen, and then the audience can just really appreciate that.
That's a good point. And like when you think about it, shows like I mean, The Shield, absolutely. But Shield, Breaking Bad, these are shows about consequences. Everything is causal from the like choices that are made. Sometimes in like the first, second, or third seasons, like very early in the show. The Shield is probably after going through it. That's probably the king of that. It did have a lot of it. It hasn't aged well in some respects, in the sense that it's very uh the episodic nature of a lot of episodes doesn't really hold up nowadays, just because it just kind of like nowadays serialized storytelling is such a big thing. Um, that these really inconsequential episodic plots, they make the show kind of drag a little bit. But once it gets towards like the last few seasons, when it starts to ditch that and just it becomes just like a cause and effect thrill ride, that's when the show really takes off.
Yeah. And we've talked about that before. I have my own thoughts of like, I think we're a little bit too much into the serialized world. Like, we swung the pendulum a little bit too far where everything is serialized and you have to watch it completely in order. Whereas I can really kind of appreciate episodic plots occasionally. Not to say The Shield, that I haven't seen that show, so that could be a case where they didn't handle it well. But something like House, I really love that show. And it's like, yeah, each episode might have a few elements that connect to other episodes, but they're mostly self-contained stories that are very tight thematically and deal with like one kind of issue that characters are dealing with, but also contribute to like the character's overall growth. Where we see House is on a certain decline, or Sopranos is the same way. We see Tony on a decline, but each episode's plot is not necessarily, you know, intimately tied to all the other plots in that episode.
Yeah, I think the best, like the balance there, and Sopranos was, I think, a good um, show that really handled it well. It's have you can still have episodic plots, but have those episodic situations reveal things about the character that end up playing a larger role down the line. That's the key part. I think that's sort of like the balance of good television. But a lot of shows end up sort of teetering onto one side or the other, whether it's like super serial, like The Wire is a great show where each I almost it's funny because like if you were to like give me a scene or a moment in The Wire, I couldn't tell you what episode it was from in a season because each season really isn't that each quote unquote episode really isn't an episode in that way we feel like it. It's just if you strung them all together, like if you just like took out all the openings and closings, it just plays out like literally one giant episode. So in that respect, it's almost and I appreciate it, but again, it's almost like too serialized in the sense, and hence why that was part of the reason why the show didn't get good ratings when it first aired.
Well, I mean, I always compare The Wire to like a novel. It's like each episode is like a chapter, but it's again, the chapters are so intimately tied together that you can't just pick up a book and start reading from the middle like you could for some other non-serialized
Yeah,
shows. It's just,
what's your favorite chapter of a book? It's like what? Like that's
yeah,
a
it's like
weird
it's
question.
only. I mean, for some books, maybe there are some. I mean, for Game of Thrones, right? You could say that, like maybe there are some chapters that you just really like, but yeah, for the most part, it's The Wire's telling one story. Maybe each season you can look at it as individual books, and you can have favorite seasons of The Wire because they each deal with different themes and subject matters. But yeah, The Wire is a novel in television form, and both for its quality and again the way it tells its story.
So to segue that into, I guess what we can talk about, because I was curious about discussing this. So of course, for I am, of course, for. I like complex storytelling. I like people who push the envelope. I like unconventional storytelling. All that. I love that. All that's good. I'd probably prefer it. However, there are times when I do like simple stories. Like just recently, me and my girlfriend watched. Not recently. It was a while ago, but it was like an Apple Plus movie. It was called, I think, Palmer or something like that, and it starred Justin Timberlake as like he's a recently released con, and he befriends this kid in his neighborhood, or like who lives in the trailer park next to him or something. And it's a very simple, conventional story. You've seen it 100 times before, but it just we really enjoyed it. It wasn't a film that was like it wasn't trying to be like this like super experimental or super unconventional story. It was just a very very simple story being told. Oh, I another movie I probably have mentioned it before. Whiplash is always a movie I go to say, yeah, um it's the perfect example of you can tell the most simple story, the most simple story, but if you tell it well, it can make it for a great movie.
I was watching. I was on a plane and I was watching The Breakfast Club because it was one of the movies they're offering there,
Nice,
and
nice.
that's one of my top 10 favorite films of all time. It's always been on my list. I think it's fantastic. But watching it again on this plane, I was just like blown away by again how simple it is. Right, it's a very cliche story. We have five, of the archetypal high school, students. The jock, the nerd, the outcast, the criminal, the princess, all coming together and learning something about each other. That can be a very cliche film, but just the fact that it's so genuine and heartfelt and honest about who these people are, and the way they're interacting with each other. It's like you don't need a lot of films nowadays have to be really like subversive, and they have to like we got to throw some twist in here or throw some whatever. But I feel like if you're genuine with your storytelling and honest with it, you can have an incredibly complicated, like incredibly simple film, but that's just it feels so real and so genuine that it shines. And I can't sing that movie's praises enough. I love the hell out of it.
What's so funny about Breakfast Club? Well, now that you mention it, I'm thinking of the Breakfast Club, like the plot, or like the story. It's interesting that the film actually is quite. It is somewhat unconventional in the sense that it's like it's not really, there is no plot. It's a hangout
No.
movie. It's and actually, now that I'm thinking of it, the ending of the film isn't really it's not really conventional either. There really isn't, like, yes, at the end, Bender and Claire kiss, and uh Emilio Estevez and Ali Sheedy kiss,
Yeah.
but at the after as they leave, there's no real, not much has changed. It's not like
No.
they're gonna go out and like everything is different now and we're gonna be
Yeah.
best friends. It's like, no, they're still shackled by the roles and the cliques that they're restrained to.
Hmm.
But the film was just about underneath all that these five people do and like have a lot in common. It really, it's almost like, I don't want to say, like, I don't want it to come off as like too pretentious, but it's almost like a psychological,
Oh, easily. Yeah.
like it's like exploration film in a sense
Yeah.
of where it's just like we're just taking these five characters and we're just kind of like realizing what makes them tick and
Yeah.
their fears and their anxieties. But at the end of the day, we're not really, these characters are not changed individuals. Like maybe this experience will lead to some shift in their characterization or their behavior down the line. But the movie really isn't about that. It just wants you to understand these characters as opposed to like, oh, we want these characters to change.
Yeah.
It's like, no, they just kind of want you to understand them,
It.
and then you as the viewer can maybe think about the people in your own life. It's like, oh, this person who I judge, and that's kind of why the film, as cliche as it is, like the jock, the criminal, the brain, as cliche as that is, it's kind of the point, is that
Yeah.
we have these preconceptions about these characters
Yeah.
based off their appearance, but then those are subverted as the film goes on.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely an open question at the end there. Like, they definitely are changed, right? They've all come to the realization that they all embody these different characteristics that they thought were individual to each member of the group. That's what the essay at the end said. It is an open question of whether anything will change like day to day. They even ask themselves that, like, come Monday morning, like, are we still friends?
Yeah,
And Claire says no, and the others say yes. And so it leaves it open to the audience to kind of interpret how they think Monday is going to go. Um, and you're right, that is unique to. I mean, it's not a typical kind of happy ending to the story. It leaves it open for interpretation. But again, I think it's for what it is. It's a movie that's also set like in one location. Not like it's almost like an independent film in the sense that like they just rented out a school for the weekend and it's shot entirely in there. But again, one of the defining films of the Brat Pack coming of age style movie that and I just think it comes down to the characters and how honest they were and how genuinely they were portrayed.
absolutely. So the reason I was asking about that was because obviously the new Avatar film is coming out. Um, actually, I think it. Oh no, it's coming out. It came out tonight, actually. I believe. Perfect timing. I'm definitely probably I'm pretty I want to see it. I actually haven't been to an IMAX movie in years. I think I saw the Jurassic Park when they re-released it in IMAX, like, but this was like 8 years ago, something nuts. Um, so yeah, so the question I had was that have you seen the original Avatar?
So I might have seen like parts of it, but we were talking about this a little bit before the podcast. You know, it's like the Avatar is one of those like franchises that just exploded, and like it's like the number one film in terms of revenue ever made. But personally, like I was never into it. And if I saw it, I saw it once years ago, but I kind of couldn't even tell you all the specific plots. I mean, I know in general it's kind of like a stereotypical, you know, dances with wolves, like man going over to the natives kind of story, but no, I've not been into the movie really.
Yeah, well, so that's what's sort of interesting is that like obviously the first film was it inexplicably made it's almost I think it still is has grossed more than Endgame. I think it's still up like at like the 3 billion mark. It's something insane. For a film that had, and a lot of people say like, oh well, James Cameron directed it. It's like that I don't think that's like the reason that it like because like most people were like, I don't think most to make like $3 billion you have like I'm thinking of like my mom. Like she's someone who would have gone to see the movie, but she didn't see the movie because oh James Cameron. Like she doesn't know who the fuck James Cameron is. It was just like this very. I still am flabbergasted by how it worked. And people were talking about the technology. It's like oh 3D yada yada. But even so, it's still like it's like unprecedented. Like I just didn't. I need like an analysis as to how it's like all the stars aligned to make this happen. It's just insane.
It was a perfect storm. I mean, that's the best way to describe it. Of you know, again, the technology, that was something a lot of people were talking about, and that the technology was really impressive in 2009. Like we hadn't had a whole decade of, you know, superhero films to make us tired of the CGI. At that time, CGI was still really cool. um, and I think the whole James Cameron angle was important to some people, but not necessarily important to like film people as much as I think the average movie going person, because the thing that he had made before that, right, was Titanic.
Mhm.
That was the other big smash. I mean, he had a lot of hits, right? But um, Titanic was another thing that just caught the public's imagination. And again, it was the same kind of deal, but just on a much grander scale with Avatar. Like people really liked the technology, right? The whole special effects that they did with recreating the Titanic and crashing and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, the story was this really cliched love story that the average moviegoer could really, you know, be like, oh my god, you know, Jack and like, is her name Rose? I can't even remember, but like Jack and
Yes.
Rose, like they're like me. And I think the same thing is true with Avatar. It's a very cliched story that the average, I don't want to use this word, but like the average bumpkin can be like, oh my god, that's me with the Navi kind of thing. I'm like Jake, you know. It's I think it's a combination again of like really impressive technology combined with a really accessible story.
Yeah, there was funny enough, Lindsay Ellis made a good film video essay on Titanic, and she talked about how the Titanic was like the perfect storm of you had like this big sweeping romance. You had the late '90s, like there was all that like very pretentious Oscar bait cinema where it was like very like pristine cinematography and like all that I did a video on Meet Joe Black. Like that was an example of that sort of thing. The big epics, like at 3 hours long. It capitalized on the disaster films that were really popular in the '90s, Armageddon, Deep Impact, all those films. Yeah, Leonardo DiCaprio, who was at like the height of like the heartthrob success. So it was just a film where it was just a perfect storm. Um, but what's so so now we get to like the question where it's like a lot of people shit on Titanic for like, oh well, it had this very like, you know, simple cliche story, and it's like, but is that really a critique? Is that like a descriptor, or is that an actual like flaw? Because I've heard, because like again, I could say Whiplash is a very simple story. It is somewhat cliche to some extent in terms of like there are like a lot of familiar tropes, but that doesn't mean I would never say that as a negative, you
Well,
know.
here's the thing, and let me correct it a little bit because we were just talking about the fact that like plots don't have to be really complex. I don't think the problem with Titanic or Avatar, from the elements that I remember, is that the plot is cliche. Now, too cliche can be a problem, of course, if you're like literally rehashing all the same tropes without adding anything to it. That is a problem. But
Hmm.
that's not necessarily the problem with Titanic. I think the problem with Titanic is the characters are really cliche. So we talked about before of like simple story, complicated characters. The characters in Titanic are the most bland, forgettable, um, just like stereotypical characters ever. The the douchey, boyfriend that she has to leave to fall in love with Jack, and he's the perfect guy who's worldly but also sensitive, and he's an artist, and she has no personality whatsoever, but she yearns for freedom, because that's what all women want. They want freedom, but they also have no personality outside of that. It's like, um, that's I think the problem that like people who analyze Titanic are bothered by. They're just like there's just nothing interesting about these people, and we're supposed to care about it because they're a romance. But the problem is, again, aside from the fact that it's sweeping and romantic, and oh no, they died, and I'm sad. Aside from those elements, like the characters just have nothing to offer us. So, and I think James Cameron like knew that. I don't think he was interested in telling the romance. I think he was just interested in like recreating the Titanic. And granted, that's really cool. But as a plot and a character, like Titanic just leaves a lot wanting.
But then it gets back to the idea of, because you kind of brought it up where you're talking about sort of like the idea of projection, like sort of, you know, because there are a lot of films where like there are a lot of like classic action film or actually, for example, a good example, you know, on Twitter I saw a lot of like the Mary Sue discourse. You know, they're talking about like Ray and Mary Sue's yada yada yada. And what kind of bugs me about that is, now I'm not saying that I do agree that there are cases like that in media. Like there are characters who are kind of Mary Sue, like they're kind of like not interesting, or their characters are kind of like unrealistically perfect and stuff like that. Sure. But what kind of bugs me about it is that there are plenty of films throughout history that really have very simple, sort of boring character archetypes. Like I almost think of like, you know, the old Jimmy Stewart films, like, you know, the Capra films, where he was just like, he wasn't this like super complex character. He was just this like very simple man, um, who was fighting against the system. Like the entire point of the character, and the entire point he was so beloved, was because of how simple he was. He wasn't this like, you know, morally gray character. He was just like this simple guy fighting against the machine. And so there's something to be said where there are cases where, and I think this kind of goes to what you were saying about Titanic and why it works so well, was that the characters being such blank slates or such simple archetypes were in a way to almost, it almost like allows the viewer to not only project themselves into the character, like, hey, that's me, or like, that's me, you know, that's, I'm this character, because they're such a blank slate, but also it kind of allows them to sort of just get swept up in the emotion, because they're not worried about like, oh, this complex character. It's like, no, it's a very simple character and extraordinary situation. And because of that, then you can, yeah, in the film, do I really see the chemistry between Jack and Rose? Like, do I see like why they love each other? Like, I guess like from the cliche angle, sure, but there is something to be said. Like, do you feel it? Like, do you feel these people in this situation? And it's like, yeah, I get that part, and I think like Cameron is going for. Even I think in the first Avatar too, where it's more about just allowing yourself to be swept up in this experience as opposed to like, thinking and sort of like looking at the film and analyzing it, like as you and I probably like when I'm watching a show or a movie, that's kind of like where my mind goes. But there are films like that Palmer film I was talking about, where it's such a simple story that I just kind of allow myself. It's nice to just be able to sort of have the permission to like, I'm not like breaking down the film and the structure and the plot movement. It's just allowing yourself to be brought into the experience.
Yeah, and it's there's nothing wrong with that either. Like there's nothing wrong like with enjoying anything, even if it doesn't meet some like pretentious person standard for what a good film is. We all have permission to like whatever we like and enjoy however movie we want to enjoy. From the accessibility angle, it totally makes sense. Like I said, the average moviegoer doesn't necessarily care about all this like deep character stuff. They like the experience of just be like, oh, I'm like Jack, I'm like Rose, I'm like Jake or whatever the guy from Avatar's name is. It's again, it's they're getting into the experience, and that's the marketability angle. That's why it's so accessible. If they, again, it's like The Wire, right? The Wire is this incredibly complicated, nuanced story, but it's also not nearly as popular as something like Avatar because the average person is not necessarily going to invest this kind of time and mental energy into analyzing it the way that the people who love The Wire do. Um, and in particular about like the older films too. You're right. A lot of the older films do not necessarily have the kind of complexity that we expect out of today's characters, but that's also because everything builds on top of each other, right? A lot of old school classic Hollywood films, it's more so like this is a new medium, right? We're inventing the genre here, and it's like, yeah, our characters might be not the most morally gray, complicated stuff that you'll see on like The Sopranos, but it's just kind of new and novel that we're making movies and we're telling stories, and we're telling a cohesive experience like this. So I think it's kind of like the people who judge Lord of the Rings against Game of Thrones, and they're like, what was Aragorn's tax policy or whatever? Well, motherfucker, he is inventing the genre here, right? Like, of course, Game of Thrones is more complicated, right? Because it's building on what Tolkien did already. So, um, I don't judge classic Hollywood on like, oh, it's gotta be as morally complicated as today. It's like the mediums build on top of each other, and that's why in today's terms, like these really cliche, complicated, the cliche characters are not as acceptable, is because well, we already did that back in the day. So if you're gonna make shit nowadays, you've got to raise the bar in some capacity because otherwise, what are we doing? There's no point in you even making this.
Well, that's the thing. It's like I almost wonder if that's sort of like the flaw in a lot of cinema nowadays, because like if so like to your point about like back in like the early days of cinema, people were trying new things. That is true to some extent for a large part, but there were still very cerebral citizen. I mean, rewatching Citizen Kane, like that's a film with like the main character is like an incredibly complex, psychologically complex individual. And then even going up through like the 70s, like say Taxi Driver came out in 1976, a film about a very psychologically dark and complex character. But that same year, Rocky came out and was a huge hit. So it's like I'm I'm all I think the point I'm making or trying to make is that I think that there should be space for both, where
Oh, there
it's
definitely is.
yeah, my I think what and I think this is like why a lot of like quote unquote film bros get a bad reputation. And I get it and I completely agree. Like I used to not, but now I do. Where it kind of does feel like when people look at stuff like this, they almost to your like you put it well, where it's like, well, what is this story saying that's new? Or what is this story saying that's like, different? And it's like, well, I mean, it does it really have to? That's like obviously like, when it comes to like if we're talking about, watershed films and like the history of films and influence, like obviously, we talk about films that were like groundbreaking and stuff. But when we think about movies, like even if we're thinking about movies when we were kids, like obviously, like we look back, we understand films like Star Wars or something, or Jaws. We understand that these films were very groundbreaking, or in many ways, like not like in more, now that we have a larger knowledge of film, we understand their place in like the film, history and whatnot. But in retrospect, when I first saw Star Wars or Jaws, I didn't like them because of that reason. It's just they were just such, they were it was the simple aspects. It was the more stripped down simple story aspects that really, got you
Yeah,
invested in the characters. And that, again, I still point to that Whiplash as a film where it's like, you can this is a film that, like, by every metric, is just, it seems so cliche in so many ways. Like, obviously, like, there's a lot of swearing and stuff, but like there have been films that have, done that before, and like, oh, but it's drumming and not this. But it's like, it's, the story is the same. But it was a film that was just so unapologetic in the fact that, like, look, this is a very simple story. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. We're just trying to take a simple story and tell it in like an incredibly fun, exhilarating fashion. And I feel like for a lot of films now, or a lot of film discourse nowadays, like, kind of overlooks that, where it's like, if it's like, well, if it's not trying to be the next,
yeah.
if it's not trying to be like psychologically complex or the next, like, Citizen Kane, then why should we even pay attention to it? And I
Well,
don't
it's
know.
interesting because I mean, you pointed out Rocky compared to Taxi Driver, but Rocky's also a psychologically complex, character. At least the first one is. He's a down on his luck boxer. He's struggling with like trying to have a feeling of self worth against this backdrop of a boxing, match. Um, Now later on, of course, yes, Rocky became a very action oriented series that abandoned a lot of character stuff. But I think when you look at a lot of like the action films that took off. Again, I think another example would be Die Hard. Die Hard is another a little bit of a kind of subversive film where it's like we got a down on his luck hero, going through a separation or divorce or whatever, and then he gets thrown into this action packed thing, and so that's kind of a little bit new and nuanced to it. Versus, yeah, of course, later on the series became very cliche action stuff. Now, again,
But
there's nothing wrong with the action or whatever, or the simple story. Um, and again, people can enjoy whatever they want. There's no argument against that. But I do think that the things that tend to stand out tend to have some element to it that's like, oh, here's the spark of creativity. It's not just a complete, CGI garbage fest without any kind of interest. That's like a Michael Bay kind of movie. Like no one's holding like Transformers One up as like a uh this changed the landscape of cinema or whatever, or like even the like people like, oh, I love this film so much. I mean, you might have enjoyed it when you watched it, but I just think like 20 years from now, that's not going to be in like in the discourse about cinema in the same way that something like Rocky or Die Hard would be. Even though those are both action movies, again, they had that one kind of element that's like, oh, here's some creativity, here's some passion for storytelling in it, versus like just the run of the mill cash grab.
But I think, like, with Rocky in particular, but that's an example of like a film where that's the whole point of, like, it really isn't that psychologically. It's not like Raging Bull that came out like a couple of years later.
Well, I think we're
It's not.
arguing like intensity versus like, yeah, not every film is going to be like, again, an incredible like Taxi Driver, an incredibly deep film, but there's some element here that's like just attempting to go beyond just the normal what we've seen before. Like it doesn't have to go all the way where it's like, again, it's like The Wire or whatever, but just having some of that passion and creativity there in some form makes it a better movie than just, again, a cash grab.
Yeah, but I think that's the whole point of like why Rocky was such a success, was because of just how simple it was and just how relatable Rocky was. Like, obviously, like, not everyone was a boxer or anything like that, but just the idea of feeling down on your luck, or feeling down on your luck, and just wanting to prove yourself. Like I think that was like the heart of the film.
Well, I think you're like, again, I don't think simplicity and originality are like exclusive. Like, I don't think just because a movie is simple, there's no creativity in it. There's no,
Well, that's
passion for
yeah, but
storytelling in it.
that's what I mean. Like that's the thing that I think is like a lot of like kind of quote unquote film bros think nowadays. Like again, like Whiplash is a film that shows, hey, like yeah, very simple story, but there was so much passion and creativity and just this electric energy in the film, and that's what made it so entertaining. But it's if we just go off of like, well, is the film trying to be like a super psychologically complex, like subversive, you know, you know, cultural like landmark. And it's like if we judge every movie by that metric, then that's sort of where I think that we start to go Ari. And then we can even that even kind of goes towards like you could even argue that's kind of the whole point of like Titanic was the fact that it was a very simple story, but it was injected into like this insane like marrying of like sweeping romance mixed with like disaster action spectacle, and that was what made the film such a success, where it was you had that very simple romance story, but it was injected into like this like insane like the first half of the film is like it's like clockwork. The first half of the film is like sweeping romance, like very cliche, very in the nose, and then the second half is like hardcore disaster, just like the most like intense shit you've ever seen in your life.
And James Cameron is not someone who, he's not Michael Bay, right? I mean, they both love their special effects, but the difference is, Cameron, has passion and creativity is pouring into this. And yeah, I think again for Titanic and Avatar, the plots and the characters didn't get the same level of love that the technology did. But even still, you can feel his passion as a filmmaker there. And I think that is why Titanic and specific and Avatar both went to the moon with their stuff versus there were plenty of films out there that were doing like sweeping romances. There were plenty of films about the Titanic before James Cameron, right? It's actually there's a huge genre of Titanic movies.
I know of that Nazi one, which was kind of weird.
Yeah, and it's like, why did none of them take off the way Cameron did? Well, it's because again he had that creativity and that passion, and again some of it was luck too, and just being the perfect place at the perfect time. But again, I think quality is always going to rise to the top, even with some of these things that we just consider kind of simple, whatever stories, as long as they have that originality, that passion from the storyteller there. That's what's going to set you apart. Not, I mean, there's plenty of movies and stuff that try to be really complex and they just come off as like cringy or, hard to follow or up its own ass. So again, it's a balancing act, and I think there's definitely room for both. Like, it's not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, it's just like that's like the one thing that bothers me, where it's like whenever I hear like that's the whole thing with Avatar, where it's like obviously the technology is great, like in Titanic, obviously like the 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 disaster aspect, the whole like final act of the film is like incredible, sure, but obviously like the fact that these films made so much money, and I'm not saying that like, oh well, they made a lot of money, that means they're good. I don't mean to say that. I mean to say the fact that like these were like unprecedented at the time, each of them actually,
Yeah,
they were like unprecedented, like box office, like this was
yeah,
like these were like cultural phenomenons. So like there's something there that like, okay, something hit a mark with
yeah.
people. It
Oh,
was
of course.
something like at what they're up to 3 billion now. Like when people say like the technology, it's like, yeah, Avatar, like it was a part of it, obviously, but the idea that it was like it made that much money just for the technology, like that, I'm sure it was like a big part, obviously,
Yeah,
like with like the whole 3D wave CGI, but there was also just something there where it was like, and again, people are like, well, it's such like a stale, boring story, but it's like I almost think that was that was the idea, where it was like if the story was more complex or cerebral, it just wouldn't have, because people weren't going to the movie expecting this like big cerebral experience. It was just we just want to see
it,
a
it hit
fun
it hit
story.
an accord.
Hmm.
And I think there is something to be said for that. And all of the highest grossing films, I have the list up here right now. Avatar, Avengers, Star Wars, Jurassic World, The Lion King, Top Gun Maverick, Fast and Furious, like all these films, again, not the most complicated films, not the most nuanced films of all time, but they are hitting they're touching people's emotions in some way. Like I watched Top Gun Maverick on the plane too, funny enough. And again, I thought to myself, like, man, this is not really that great of a film in terms of the character. Like, it's a very simple story. Like, you could predict way ahead of time what's going to happen. It's kind of the typical sports movie of like we're coming from behind. It looks like we're about to lose, and then we win at the end. And there's something where I was like, oh, it's that great. But again, I think being able to hit that note of like touching people's emotions, inspiring them, creating this feeling of happiness. That's something that a lot of these kind of edgy movies forget about, and they don't really get that. And if you look at all these films, they're almost all pretty like inspiring, pretty happy. Like, yeah, Titanic, they die at the end, but even still, she's like, I'll always love you. It's kind of a heartwarming thing. And I think when people go to the movies, they want to feel happy. They want to have their emotions and hearts touched, and that's reflected here in this box office numbers. So, um, you know, I'm not saying all movies have to be that way. Not all movies aspire to make billions. Sometimes people just want to tell a certain kind of story because it's a story they have in their hearts. Sopranos did not make the most money of all time, but it's the story David Chase wanted to tell, and so
You
it's
know, it's
successful in that regard.
it's interesting. I'm glad you brought that up, because I was just thinking about this. What's interesting is that, well, so if I'm looking at the top grossing movies, it is just like, it is amazing though. If you look at like the top like 30 top grossing films, like all the films that have grossed over $1 billion, it's insane that almost all of them are like big franchises. Like, and like Avengers Endgame, like it made a lot of money, but obviously like it had the benefit of having so many, it's such a built-in fan base. In Star Wars The Force Awakens, again, you have such a massive fan base already. The fact that Avatar and Titanic, two completely individual brand new IPs, were like, that's just, it's unexplainable to me. I'm just like, this is James Cameron like made a deal with the devil or something. Like, this is
Yeah,
insane.
sold his soul, yeah, for box office money. And I mean, it is, again, like I said, it was the perfect damn storm, and I guess he's just there's something about James Cameron where he knows. I mean, you could argue that maybe Avatar's coasting a little bit off the Titanic, because the Titanic was definitely like there ain't no there's no excuse you can make for the Titanic success. Like, you could make an excuse for all the Disney films on this list that they're like, oh, it's Disney, right? They have the branding and all this kind of stuff. Same with Star Wars and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, Titanic is a hit that any director would fucking give their left nut to have, and he hit it twice.
Oh, so yeah, so I'm glad you brought up Tony Soprano, because funny enough, one of the other big um highest grossing films was Joker, which made over
Mm,
$1 billion, which for a rated R film, that is like,
yeah,
I think is it the top grossing rated R film of all time, if I'm not mistaken?
might be.
Because that's such a huge, like, that's a whole other ballpark when we're talking about, the
Is the
first rated
Dark
R
Knight
film to
rated
do
R?
so. Now it's PG-13.
Uh, yeah, you're right. Yeah, so I guess it'd be Joker.
Yeah, so something that kind of got onto me for Joker was that when I watched Joker, I was actually kind of disappointed in it, because of how, ironically, because of how simple it was. It didn't really strike me. I was watching it and I was like, this film seems very paint by numbers in a way, where it was just the story of this guy who just, he's down his luck, he's a loser, and he just gets pushed too far, and he keeps pushing and pushing and pushing. And yes, there were scenes where it was like shocking, but as I'm watching the movie, it felt very almost like very, I'm trying to think of the right word. There weren't really that many twists and turns in the movie that were like completely out of left field, or like, oh, I didn't see that coming at all. It felt very natural. But at the same time, after like rewatching it, I'm like, I think this was kind of part of the reason why, especially like, a lot of younger dudes, they kind of resonated with it, because it was just, the film wasn't really trying to say, like, it did have a couple things to say about like, mental health care and stuff. It's kind of on the nose. It was okay, but the movie was just trying to tell a story of this portrait of this guy who was
Yeah,
just, down his luck, and he gets pushed too far, and everything else around it, like the Joker, the costume, and all that stuff, that's just kind of set dressing. And
yeah,
at the core of it is just this, it's a very simple story. And the reason I thought it was funny you brought up Sopranos was because we've talked about it a lot when it comes to like characters like Walter White or Tony Soprano. I feel like a lot of the fandom sometimes, they oversimplify the characters to try and make them more palatable or accessible, or more like, what's the word I'm looking for? More sympathetic, so they can almost imprint themselves. Like Walter White is a perfect example of, like, I think he is a very complex character. He has a lot of psychological complexity rooted in his childhood, and toxic masculinity and all these things. But sometimes when I talk to fans, it's almost like they make him so simple. They want him to just be like, no, he was just this down as luck guy, and he got he just wanted to help his family. They almost make him like this very, almost like simplistically
yeah,
heroic character who just went too far. And I
yeah,
think that there is something to be said about, like, obviously we love complex characters, but the more simple characters, whether it's like Rocky or you know Arthur Fleck from the Joker, sometimes that level of simplicity of the character can actually be a
yeah,
benefit in a way where it can kind of get the viewer invested more. Like with, like someone like Travis Bickle, I related to him to some extent, but at the same time I was kind of like, this isn't a guy that you know I don't want to
yeah,
grab a beer with this dude.
I-
Um but then with other characters, like the more simplistic they are, the
yeah,
more sort of like cut and dry they are, the
yeah.
more, I don't know, it's just something
I
that kind of resonates
Yeah.
with people.
No, no. I think the Joker specifically, right? What the like it is a simple, predictable story, but it's because it's taking these two kind of elements and putting it together. It's taking Taxi Driver and putting it in the DC universe, right? It's like a superhero coat of paint on it. But it's the same plot we've seen in Taxi Driver, and I think they're very open with that too. I think even on the Wikipedia page, right at the beginning, it says like, yeah, it's expired. It's inspired by Taxi Driver and King of Comedy, um, and so that is the creative element there of like, and it can be creative too at times to take one element right here and put it over here. Um, the Sopranos, right? You take The Godfather, you put it in Therapy, and you got The Sopranos, right? That's like that's a simple way of looking at it. And I think that there is something to be said there that creates novelty, and it creates a new experience when you just take two familiar elements and put it together. Um, Now, in terms of what you're talking about, of like again people simplifying these characters, I think that's to be expected. And again, I don't know how to say this without coming off incredibly pretentious, but I think the average person who watches anything, right, is average. They're not, and it's not that like you and me are so fucking smart and we get it and no one else fucking does. It's like I think you and me put the work into really thinking about shows like this, and we're not the only ones, of course, but people who understand The Sopranos and understand Breaking Bad, right? It's because they put a lot of effort into understanding. I don't think I really understood the shows the first time I watched it, but for some people, they're not really looking to spend a lot of time thinking about this or analyzing it. And it's again, it's movies like Avatar and Titanic that appeal to people who don't want to put a lot of analysis into it. And um again, that's just a personal choice, right? There's tons of stuff in life that you and me don't focus on and don't spend a lot of time thinking about. It's just in our case, television and film happens to be one that we actually do put a lot of our effort into. But for other things in life, we're probably the simpletons who don't get it compared to the people who dedicate their life to understanding it.
Yeah, and but again, it's like I almost again, I think like at least when I was younger, or I was kind of like kind of up my own ass about that, where I was like, yeah, I see like what you guys don't see, but then I also understand where it's like a lot of people just kind of they just want to go to the movies and just enjoy the movie. Yeah, they don't, and I've kind of gotten over that hump, and now I'm able to like do like with me and my girlfriend, like we don't really watch like sometimes we'll watch like good, quote unquote like top tier cinema. But other times we're just like, hey, want to watch this like shitty, like like this like shitty simple movie on Netflix, and then sometimes it turns out to be a pleasant surprise where it's like, hey, that actually wasn't bad. Like because it almost felt good to be able to just kind of watch the film and not having to like I don't want to have to decipher the characters' motivations. I just kind of want it to be kind of simple.
Yeah. No, and again, we I think we've established this that like something doesn't have to be complex to be good. I do think it has to be quality to be good. Like I
Mm,
think anything I enjoy has some element where I was like, they didn't just like a bunch of studio execs didn't just shove this shit together because they knew it would make money. Like I don't think I've ever watched something like that and enjoyed it. But like a simple story can still be really great as long as there is like that genuine storytelling there, a focus on quality. Again, doesn't have to be complex, doesn't have to be really nuanced. Um, but I think the person making it does have to have a passion for what they're doing, and they're not again just making paint by the numbers for the sake of like, oh yeah, we're gonna make this X amount of money and we're gonna move on to something else.
mhm.
That
I
is the
think that
mark for
was
me.
I think Luc Besson, who was involved in the production of Taken, like with Liam
Mm,
Neeson, the original Taken film. I have to find the quote, but he said something. I think I read it in a screenwriting guide, and he was talking about if you can't deliver on scale, you have to deliver on intensity.
yeah,
And that's a film where he was like, yeah, the film itself is like an ex like operative's daughter is
yeah,
kidnapped and he goes to
very
find her.
cliche.
It's like insanely like if someone were to tell me that plot, I'd be like fuck off. Like what do you like
Yeah,
this is the dumbest thing. But the film was just so unapologetic in the fact that like, no, this is the plot and we're gonna tell the fuck out of the story. It's such
yeah,
a simple story, but we're gonna tell the fuck out of it completely
yeah,
unapologetically. We're not gonna try to make it like we're not gonna try and make it like, over like, complex or like subversive.
yeah,
It's just like this dude's gonna find his fucking daughter and it's gonna be badass.
yeah,
And that's why it just works because I think that's it's funny. I think it almost, and this is sort of why I think I respect James Cameron to an extent, as much as like an asshole that I've heard that he can be. He's so unapologetic in the sense, or like he kind of seems. I don't. Well, maybe not. But actually, no. I will say it. He does kind of seem like a very unpretentious person. I'm sure he's arrogant, but
yeah,
he
yeah,
doesn't seem. I don't think he's pretentious. When he talks about his films, he's just like, I'm just gonna like give you the best fucking film you've ever seen.
yeah.
Like he almost has like a Michael Bay attitude, but with like a lot more craft and
Hmm.
creativity. Where
Yeah,
it's just like I'm not trying to like, oh, I'm gonna give you a subversive experience that's gonna like like and fill it with like philosophical references. Like no, dude, I'm like time traveling robots. Like let's just fucking
yeah.
go. I want to
Fucking
make that
do it.
shit fucking sing.
Yeah.
And I kind of respect that. I'm like, fuck yeah, man.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's the same way with like Tarantino, right? It's like if you listen to Tarantino talk, he fucking loves movies and he loves garbage films that he saw in his when he was working at the DVDs or the the VHS store in the 90s, and he knows them all. He knows like cop dog and random little shit that he loves the fucking medium, and I think that shows. There's a passion there and a lack of pretension, even though his movies are subversive in a lot of ways and are very like artistic. I mean, they have a voice. Just like I think James Cameron has a voice, even though a lot of it's technology and a simple action-packed story. He does have a style, and there's passion there that, um, you know, it's the reason why his work has stood out above the rest. One of the reasons, at least. There's a lot of reasons why we've been talking about why those movies were as successful as they were. But I heard Avatar is actually not doing so well. At least in China, I heard the numbers in China were not good, and they were banking on
Uh-oh.
that being a huge part of their.
Well, those would be pre-sale tickets, right? Because it,
Yeah, yeah,
it
yeah. Pre-sale
premieres
tickets. Yeah,
tonight, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
But that is, what a lot. That's what cinema has become. It's like you have to make all your money in the first weekend, or the movie failed.
Did you see? It was the clip with Matt Damon on Hot Wings when he was talking about how film has evolved over the last 20 years.
No, I can check that out, but no, I've not seen it.
Yeah, so he was talking. The question was, it's like what has been one of the biggest factors in like the like why has cinema moved to like why does it feel like a lot of like smaller films are kind of dying out and like we're kind of getting like these big tent pole films that kind of dominate the entire market. And funny enough, I actually remember this quote. I don't know where I saw it, but I 100% know I read it. It was James Cameron, actually. And George Lucas also said this. They said that they think the future of cinema is going to be you're not going to see, instead of studios making like a bunch of different films that come out throughout the year, some lower budget, some higher budget. What's going to happen is all those smaller budget films are going to go to like streaming services, and theaters there's only going to be like 3 movies a year that studios are going to put out, but these things are going to be like they're going to be like Avatar. They're going to be like $250 million to make, and they're going to be like these massive huge spectacles that everyone's going to see. And like that's then right around that time the IMAX theaters started to get popular. It's like it's turning into like this big experience, not just going to a theater.
We should talk about that in one of our next, because we're hit our hour here, but and I think we talked about it briefly, but there's a lot of reasons for like the change, or some would say the decline in Hollywood and movie going, that we could definitely unpack. But you're right, it's marked a fundamental change in how we view movies and the kind of movies that get made, and what the future of Hollywood's going to look like. So we'll tackle that, but for now we've hit our hour. It's been nice chatting with you as always, and we're gonna do some more of these, so they're coming.
Let's do it up, homie. I'm excited.
Awesome, cool. Well, thank you guys for watching, and stay tuned for the next episode. No One's a Critic, coming soon.
Take care, y'all.